are cooking at the same time as you're doing Facebook. No, I'm joking. It's a terrible joke. Okay, apologies. Comrades, let's make a beginning. So this afternoon, we've very privileged to have Comrade Zain Dangor. I think he's known to most of you. Just to remind us something, he was the DG, Director General in Social Development, at a really tough time when at the height of the peak of capture, when that department was particularly captured. And Zain fought a really brave and admirable and battle, and refused to basically cooperate with what was going on there, and eventually left the department. He's currently the special advisor to the Minister of International Relations, Comrade Naledi. And he tells me something that I'd forgotten, that he's come full circle because he worked, was it in Washington, Zain? Or
yes.
Washington. With Human Rights Watch.
International Human Rights Law Group. It's now called Global Rights, yeah.
Okay. So he has a strong background apart from, but in general, what has been consistent has been his deep focus and compassion, basically, for social issues, including the topic that we've got today, which is the issue of hunger, which, Comrade Zain, is one of the themes that we launched or relaunched for our so-called Red October campaign, along with human settlements, health, and the issue of water. So, Comrade Zain, really, thanks very much for making time, and I'm sure what is a very busy schedule. And we really look forward to your input. So over to you, Comrade Zain.
Thank you, comrades. And if I go too fast, just stop me. Let me start again. It's a pleasure and an honor to give this talk. I won't use the word lecture, so it's a discussion. And it's taking me back to essentially the mid-2000s in social development, when after I think the 2007 ANC conference, Food for All was on the agenda. And the Food for All program was one that we were tasked to at social development to start thinking about. So I'll talk to some of those issues. I'm not going to give a lot of statistics because, there's a lot of statistics on household poverty that I can send afterwards, and the impact on that on food insecurity and malnutrition. I'll speak a bit about that, but also and talk about the difference between hunger and malnutrition as well. But I'm going to talk more about the kind of policies required to eradicate poverty. So the kind of issues that I'm going to do is a quick overview of the status quo, where we are. And then I want to tell the story of Belo Horizonte, which is Brazil's 4th largest city. And this is the only city in the world that successfully managed to eradicate hunger. And it was the basis on which the Brazilian Workers' Party developed their Fome Zero program on, which is basically zero hunger. I'll talk a bit about the nascent approach to mirror this approach, the Zero Hunger campaign, and what we called Food for All by the ANC and by government. And then a discussion about why we stalled, and what I'll talk about are competing policy narratives, and conclude on that for questions and answers. So on the status quo, what we do know is that even before this year, 2020, hunger, unemployment, and other problems associated with the economics of exclusion was rampant. And of course, these have been exacerbated by COVID-19. Experiences of hunger has risen, and this is due to a number of reasons. Rising food prices. The food price hikes during the lockdown periods were excessive. And it's been eating not only into those most vulnerable, but even the lower middle classes, the middle classes have been complaining about food affordability. This has been exacerbated by loss of income, and then also by lack of access to markets for small scale producers. So you essentially find that those who do produce food have not been able to sell the food in the way that they have been doing before 2020. And that has basically decimated the small producers in the food space. and ironically concretize the dominance of what we call the corporate the corporate food value chain. So hunger and malnutrition is an urgent challenge. I think the difference between hunger and malnutrition is people can experience hunger, and sort of when you measure the reduction in the experience of hunger, doesn't mean people are eating nourishing food. So people will say, for example, during when we spoke about the distribution of grants, we found that in the early phases of it, that people were reducing, the experience of hunger was reducing, but the actual quality of the food was not giving rise to people dealing with malnutrition. And that's why healthy food is always a key issue. So when we talk about hunger and malnutrition, we must just make sure that we get through understand the differences. What will our responses be going forward? Are we going to tinker on the margins of a systemic food insecurity problem, which deals with the value chain, which is very integrated from production all the way to the supermarkets? Or are we going to begin to, just again, as we've done over the last 2 decades or so, tinker on the margins, seek to provide better access to food here and there, but without actually dealing with the food economy? And I'll talk a bit about that. So when people talk about eradicating hunger and saying that hunger is something that we can do away with, there's always this approach that perhaps it's too big a task. And when we started developing an approach to the Food for All campaign, we did some research and we looked at where has this been done successfully, and we came across the city of Belo Horizonte, and I spent some time there together with social development staff, and we took people from the departments of agriculture and others there over a period of time, and then also looked at how did that impact on the broader Zero Hunger campaign in Brazil, led by the Workers' Party. But I think let me start by just telling the story of Belo Horizonte. So it's Brazil's 4th largest city. So in 1993, it had a population of 2.5 million. It has since grown. At that stage, it had 11% of its population living in absolute poverty and 20% of its children going hungry. So you'll find that it's similar kind of scenarios to South Africa because we've got a similar level of inequality. 1993, the Workers' Party were building power from the bottom. So, they started taking over the equivalent of the provinces and municipalities through elections. And in the areas where they had power, they declared food as a right of citizenship, which is similar to our constitution, which actually the right to food is in our constitution, but we haven't really worked on that as a right of citizenship. The Workers' Party did that. So in Belo Horizonte, what this meant was that they had a program that essentially weaved together the interest of farmers and consumers. And I'll speak a bit about the farmers in particular. So what they did in Belo Horizonte is they decided to set up popular markets and incentivize small farmers or family farms to sell directly to consumers. And they cut out the wholesalers. In essence, and I'll go into a bit more detail on this, 5 acres of land, which from a productive perspective looks small, became viable because by cutting out the wholesalers, the farmers became more profitable. And from the Brazilian, the Belo Horizonte management perspective, food was reaching consumers at a largely reduced price. So how did they support the small farmers? And they did that in various ways. The first issue was land. Land was made available for small farmers. And so 2 ways, land was granted to people, so family farms. So you essentially had family farms emerging in and around Belo Horizonte. From public land was also put up for bid for small-scale producers to bid for allotments of land, public land, provided they they abide by certain conditionalities. One of those conditionalities is that they had to produce nutritious food on that allotment of land. The second conditionality is that every weekend, if you've got this allotment of land, you have to drive to the poorer neighborhoods outside of the city, set up popular markets, and sell to the local population at a reduced price. In that way, they begin to deal with the issue, the distribution problem of food. What Belo Horizonte also did was they established what was called people's restaurants. So these people's restaurants was not soup kitchens. They deliberately moved away from the soup kitchen model. These were actual restaurants, large. You know, they serve school food on a scale. We visited some of those. The plate of a particular food of plate with predetermined nutrients sold for less than R1 per person. So if you were on the social security system, and this was the Bolsa Familia, which is the equivalent of a combination of our child support grants, state old age pensions, but it's essentially all the money that went into a particular household. If you had a social security card, you swiped your card and it was less than R1, I think it was 50 cents. And others who could afford more paid through cash or through other means, or through other cards. But essentially, there was no stigma. This was not seen as a poor people's restaurant. It was called a people's restaurant. When we were there, we paid, we sat down, we saw people from the middle classes, the lower middle classes, workers, taking a break from working, all of them coming into this restaurant. And essentially the food distribution to the poorest and most marginalized, were 80% of the people who used the popular restaurants were done in a way where there was no stigma attached. And there was the element of cross-subsidization taking place as well. Okay, so, and the important issue was dealing away with the soup kitchens, the kind of food parcel approach to dealing with making sure food gets to the most vulnerable. Food in these popular restaurants, as was the case with hospitals, the army, any place that the state, whether it was a local government or national, had to procure food, was procured or purchased from your local farmers or family farms. And Belo Horizonte did this exceptionally well. In essence, they guaranteed a market for people's produce. And they had a law that they passed that all hospitals, clinics, aside from the popular restaurants, had to buy 30% of all their produce from the small scale farmers. So the problem of market access was being dealt with. The second leg of their program was extensive school nutrition programs. So every school had to have a kitchen. Every school had to serve nutritious meals per day, and all the food served in these schools were purchased from the small farms and the family farms, and some of the other local growers in the area. The third leg, and it doesn't seem important, but it was incredibly important, was they combined the issue of production and consumption with nutrition education programs, because they found that poor people made rational choices, that they would buy the cheapest food, which was not necessarily the most nutritious food. And the nutrition education programs at the hospitals, at stores, and they use other forms of multimedia, they would actually educate people about what would be nutritious food. So move away from having too much starch, have a mix of proteins, and they would have it at the bus stops, in the taxis, in the supermarkets. And then they also had a basket of goods that was price controlled. So they would look at the most nutritious food that people would eat on a daily basis, and those foods had a price control element on it. The combination of all these measures meant that Belo Horizonte became the first city in the world, and in fact, the only city in the world to eradicate hunger. And eradicate, well, not eradicate, but reduce malnutrition significantly. So Belo Horizonte's program became the blueprint for the Workers' Party when they took over the national government sometime later. And then the Forma Zero program had the same building blocks as Belo Horizonte. The Workers' Party and the national program understood that food was accessed in three ways. You either grew food, you purchased it, or you accessed it through social protection systems. The Forma Zero also understood that in a purely market-driven, or what we call a corporatized food market, big corporations would dominate the entire value chain from production to consumption. Like South Africa, Brazil had a vertically integrated monopoly. The big farms owned massive amounts of land and had almost a share ownership in the major middlemen, from those who purchased it from farmers, brought it to the markets and the distribution channels. And what the Forma Zero program did was deliberately sought to undo that. Okay. So the social security component, Bolsa Familia, as I mentioned, the popular restaurants, the food at reduced prices, inclusive of price controls of a specific basket of goods, was central to this. A massive school nutrition program was in place. They had a family agriculture and family agriculture food procurement program. And when I say family agriculture, it's also small scale agriculture. And this guaranteed access to markets. So on a sliding scale, at points, depending on the area, it would be 30% minimum, but that went up to about 70% of required procurement from family farms and small scale producers. Important element of this is it reduced what we call the food carbon footprint. And this was carefully planned. The entire Zero Hunger program, as taken from the experience in Belo Horizonte, is that food is largely consumed close to where it is produced. The radius they used was generally food must be consumed within 100 kilometers of where it's produced. And this had enormous implications for land use rules and patterns. So you had local land reform that takes place to make sure that people had access to land for food purposes and food production purposes. Some of it would be ownership, but a lot of it would be leasing land from the state to produce food. It meant unbundling at points, big farms, and the early stages, there's quite a lot of cooperation, but I'll talk about the critical success factors and some of the challenges. But by reducing the food carbon footprint and incentivizing small scale farmers, the food distribution channel was narrowed. Aside from the middlemen being big corporates being taken out of the equation largely, you saw the emergence of cooperatives, whether it was small dairy cooperatives who would help the farmers take milk from where it's produced, kept safely in a dairy, and take it to market. So you find that a new food economy emerged, a new food distribution network emerged. And all of this was changing in much of Brazil once it became national, the food economy and some of the challenges. So what were the critical success factors of this? The first one was political will. In Belo Horizonte, you had a mayor who led from the front, a governor as well. So you had his name was Arianes. And this was taken up by President Lula of the Workers' Party. President Lula led the Forma Zero project directly. He established an interministerial committee to drive this, which brought together all the key government departments that will ensure that this food distribution network and its various elements, from production to popular markets, to price controls, to the social security networks, was basically put under one roof and led by himself. This was combined in that wonderful period of the Workers' Party when the economic growth and the social policies really brought down absolute poverty, led by essentially two additional measures, which was real increases in minimum wages. Because the real increases in minimum wages complemented the Bolsa Familia program, which was money to households through social protection. And the Workers' Party also pegged, for example, the minimum wage for their own state old age pension, which means that the poverty rate for older persons was almost wiped out, but it also allowed older persons to purchase quality food. So the kind of malnutrition rates and illnesses that one would find in elderly population was reduced tremendously with enormous cost savings to the health departments. For younger people, similar health benefits, but it also meant that people were able to go out and be more productive in society. President Lula also made sure that civil society was involved. He set up a presidential advisory council, which included social movements such as the Landless People's Movement and others involved in land issues and food production issues. Now, the challenge that emerged is that in the initial phases, there was very little organized resistance from big corporate farmers. But later on, towards the end of the Workers' Party program, the disaffected big corporations who felt that their market share in the food industry fell so dramatically began to link up with others who were similarly challenged by the changes in structural, the changes that the Workers' Party was making to the economy. And this led to a whittling away of the Workers' Party's influence, and the car wash issue emerged immediately after. But I think this is one thing when we're discussing with the Workers' Party, is that they didn't look at how to keep big corporations in the tent to a certain extent. Okay. What was the impact on this? Why did we do this detailed studies? Given the Food for All program, most of us here would know that the ANC manifesto of 2009, coming out of the conference of 2007, asserted that a commitment to food and nutrition security would be a central piece of what the ANC would be doing forward. The borrowing from the Freedom Charter that stated rent and prices shall be lowered, food would be plentiful, and no one should go hungry. So the manifesto of 2009 provided us with the following guidance: promote food security as a way to lessen our dependence on food imports. And this has important linkages to the notion of food sovereignty, that if your food market is largely dependent on imports and you don't have enough production at the local level, your sovereignty in relation to food is threatened, because shifts in your foreign markets, a collapse of the economy and productive capacity in areas from which you produce would lead to significant food shortages. So food sovereignty is an important issue that the ANC thought about in 2007 up to 2009. We were guided to introduce a Food for All program to procure and distribute basic foods at affordable prices to poor households and communities. And government was to develop an appropriate institutional framework for this. We were supposed to, and we were guided by the ANC to introduce measures to improve the logistics of food distribution. Again, transportation, warehousing, procurement, and outsourcing. Now, doesn't sound important, but if you take it along the lines of the 4.0 approach, the intention here was also to reduce the food carbon footprint, and also to bring production and consumption patterns closer together. At the discussions, and it was absurd to think that the biggest food market in the whole of Africa was the Johannesburg market, where in fact very little was produced in Johannesburg. Most of it was produced in places like the Eastern Cape, the Free State, and then the logistics to bring it here is where a lot of the cost factors came in. So again, the intention there from the ANC and in guiding government was to do that. Government was also asked to expand access to food production schemes in rural and peri-urban areas so that people could grow their own food. And then extension services were supposed to kick in, the provision of tractors, fertilizers, and other services such as how to protect crops through environmentally friendly pesticides. So other measures that were going to be considered was health facilities, churches, and other urban settings becoming places where people could access food through a social social security format, but also the idea of a school nutrition program that had to be massified emerged. And we can, those of us who in government would remember that word massification was always on the agenda. Okay. We were supposed to also then strengthen the food relief program on a mass scale. So food assistance to poor households was on the agenda. So you can see as early as 2009, the Zero Hunger program, the Food for All program, was on government's agenda. That's why we went to Belo Horizonte. That's why we looked at the Fome Zero program. And we had the building blocks for that. So immediately afterwards, the kind of plans that were put in place, and I'm skipping a few of my speaking notes, was that a ministerial food security advisory committee was established. Comrade Derek Hanekom chaired an ANC-led committee, firstly outside of government. Social development was part of that. Derek Hanekom was then at Science and Technology at that point. But he brought together Department of Agriculture and Department of Social Development and other key players. The reason why we went to Derek Hanekom was that for some reason or the other, we could not get the leadership from within social development or agriculture at that point, and a decision from within the ANC was made that Comrade Derek would lead on this. But what emerged was the household food and nutrition strategy, which mirrored in many, many ways Fome Zero. And so the Ministerial Food Security Advisory Committee was set up, which was an IMC, which was to be chaired by the president, which was delegated to the deputy president, assisted by the Minister of Social Development. This was established. Okay. Why did we not implement all of this? So if we looked at the critical success factors from Brazil, political leadership was in place, political will, driving from the front, and there was consequential implementation of the policies that was agreed on. In our case, I've got some question marks. Was it a lack of political will? Was it a state capacity issue? Or was it the influence of corporate agriculture and related interests right at the start? And my own view is a combination of both. Because when we developed the household food and nutrition strategy and we engaged with other government departments, the first issue that fell off from the Fome Zero menu that we put up was the price controls on the basket of goods. We were told that South Africa doesn't do price controls, even on food. And this came from the Competition Commission, but the influence of the big corporates in the food value chain was quite significant. So that did fall from the wayside. But it was an indicator of the level of policy advocacy taking place from those who wanted to keep this vertically integrated market structure. Okay. We had national working groups in all of the provinces. We had food fortification led by the Department of Health. We made the argument for the extension of the child support grant so that cash to households would allow people to purchase food. We supported food banks, and we then set up nascent and popular restaurants. The first one was in Manenberg in Cape Town, but that was the end of it. None of these issues came to fruition. So we had, on paper, we've got a really good basis for having our own Zero Hunger campaign with related policy measures. But because of a combination of factors, including the lack of political will, we just did not carry it through. And by the time it came to 2015, 2016, the impetus towards implementing the household food nutrition strategy had completely collapsed. Lehotla after Lehotla, there would be a line saying the ANC and government must implement the household food and nutrition strategy, which was agreed to by cabinet. It was never implemented. It was one of those key important issues that took many years to develop and design that just fell by the wayside. And many of the problems that we experience now would have been mitigated. You know, we made the example for it that in the 2007-2008 crisis, the fact that South Africa And the poorest South Africans would be spared from the worst impact of the financial and economic crisis. It was because we had a rather robust cash transfer program in place that shielded people from the worst accesses. If we had the 4 May Zero program, our own homegrown Food for All program in place that was approved by Cabinet, perhaps the worst aspects of this current crisis may have been mitigated to a certain extent, because what it would have called for was, the universalization of the child support grant, the universalization of the state old age pension. It also called for the universalization of, not the universalization, but through the comprehensive social security program, the building blocks of a basic income grant, which has now become an issue that people think is almost, without a doubt, one of the necessary building blocks to deal with the post-COVID reality. So this is where we went wrong. We had all of this in place. I mean, when people talk about eradicating hunger and eradicating poverty, and you see, the work being done by the Food Sovereignty Coalition, a lot of this is done with the recognition that government itself, the alliance-led government, had in place a program that would have mirrored in many ways the Zero Hunger program that was so successful under the Workers' Party in Brazil. And when we did the analysis about why this happened, it's the same approach. So I mentioned political will, I mentioned state capacity, but also there's a policy issue that runs through many of the weaknesses that we have. It's the two narratives about what are the problems in South Africa and what are the ways of getting out of it. The one narrative is that, much of our problem, narrative one, I would call it, is that the only challenge we have in South Africa is issues of capacities. People don't have enough capacity, and we need to rebuild the opportunity structures and help individuals to develop capabilities. So the capabilities issues, and this is the one way in which people would find their way out of poverty. The same issue in the food market. The second narrative, and this is, I know it's important that we stick to the narrative of the food issue, but this is important in terms of how policies then get dumped or shifted. The second narrative is quite the opposite. The second narrative, and you'll see this, the first narrative comes in the economics chapter of the NDP. The second narrative comes in the social, the social component of the NDP, which is chapter 9, which actually talks about South Africa's problems is due to deliberate policies of social exclusion, deliberate policies of economic exclusion, and that the key problems in the economy is not only a lack of skills in education, and the structural issues within the economy that drives poverty and inequality. So the second narrative is the one in which those of us who designed the Food for All program looked at, this is the analysis, this is the way we should go. That's why we looked at the Brazilian model. The first narrative would look at the market and said that, the reason why we're not getting enough nutritious food to households is because there's not enough jobs, which is a genuine concern, but not looking at restructuring the economy, including the food economy, so that the food economy is one in which, through reducing the food production and consumption patterns, you transform the food economy, which creates jobs at local level, but also means that people have access to nutritious food produced locally and protects them from the vagaries of international food markets. So these two narratives, which find themselves in many other spaces, played itself out in the discussions around a strategy to eradicate hunger. And I think going forward, if we don't confront the fact that there are these two narratives at play within our own policy context, in our own policy nexus, we are not going to be able to deal with the issues. So for example, the basic income grant is on the agenda now. In February, March, April, a presidential task team sat and came up with quite significant ways of improving transfers to households. And in the end, the issue of affordability was brought up, which stymied the full impact of what was designed by a really good presidential task team led by Kate Phillip and others. So I'm going to conclude on that note. You know, the building blocks of our own Food for All program I can share with people. But in the end, unless we deal with the normative issues around our policy frameworks, you know, so, you know, the idea of a solidarity economy, solidarity-based economy, unless we embrace it fully as the Alliance, we may find that some of the better policy frameworks that emerge would be thrown on the wayside on other considerations that are more neoliberal, more market-driven. And that normative issue must be dealt with, I think, and the SACP is perhaps the best organization to lead on that. Comrade Jeremy, I think I'm gonna stop there and take questions and answers, yeah?
Wonderful. Thank you, Comrade Zen. I think that's exactly extremely helpful, very insightful. It sounds like it's quite autobiographical, understandably, and coincides, I think, with the kinds of autobiographies that several others of us also have, a sense of having had good policies which got stymied, whether, you know, in a variety of other sectors, not unrelated. So, comrades, we'll now open up for discussion.